afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anne Verghese, and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. I extend a warm welcome to all to today's ICS Wednesday seminar titled British Influence on India's Recognition for the People's Republic of China. India-China relations have always been a contentious realm. India's move to recognize the People's Republic of China in 1949 is often highlighted as a misstep. Conventional narratives often frame it as a policy decision informed by Prime Minister Nehru's idealism or naivety. In contrast, this seminar will serve to steer away from this rhetoric and shed light on the underlying lingering influence of British colonialism on India's foreign policy elite, which played a crucial role in shaping this decision. Through an analysis of archival records, the speakers will examine how the embeddedness of British policy directives in the Indian foreign policy establishment influenced India's China policy. This more nuanced understanding of the complex interplay between post-colonial influences and emerging national interests would help to better understand the shaping of India's diplomatic trajectory during the formative years of its independence. The speakers for today's seminar are Dr. Atul Bharadwaj and Dr. Muhammad Chingiz Khan. Dr. Atul Bharadwaj is an academic and strategic affairs analyst currently affiliated with the School of Policy and Global Affairs at City St. George's, University of London. His research examines the intersection of geopolitics, maritime strategy, and shifting connectivity paradigms. Dr. Muhammad Chingiz Khan is an assistant professor at the Center for Comparative Religion and Civilization, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. He specializes in the medieval and early modern history of Northeast India, with significant contributions to its historiography, genealogical history, military warfare, and technology. Unfortunately, since he is unwell, he will not be presenting today. However, he will be present for the discussion. The chair for today's seminar is Ambassador Vijay K. Nambiar. He is a veteran Indian diplomat who joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1967. Over the span of his illustrious career, he held several high-profile positions that spanned critical moments in Indian and global diplomacy. Ambassador Nambiar was India's permanent representative to the UN from 2002 to 2004, and later served as the Deputy National Security Advisor. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Ambassador Nambiar.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for this introduction. Let me, at the outset, I don't know whether the ICS has formally said anything at previous Wednesday seminars on the memory of A.S. Bhasin, the former director of the Historical Division of MEA, and a good friend of mine. I thought I'll use this very briefly to pay a tribute to him. Bhasin Saab's contribution to the compilation of Indian official documentation pertaining especially to the subjects like the one we are examining today has been quite singular. His monumental compilations of official documents assembled over decades transformed the study of Indian diplomacy, and by systematically documenting notes, correspondence, and diplomatic exchanges from the formative Nehru years, he illuminated a period which has often been obscured by later conflict as well as unbecoming retrospective polemic. At today's Wednesday seminar, therefore, at least I would like to earnestly salute his memory. Coming to the subject of today's seminar, according to conventional wisdom, India's recognition of the People's Republic of China in April 1950 is generally seen and explained within India more as a consequence of the country's post-colonial agency, of Nehruvian strategic reasoning, and of our, as it were, Asianist political imagination. It is rarely seen as influenced by the lingering influence of British colonial legacies that shaped the style of Indian diplomacy, much less as resulting from an inherited faith in the so-called Western notions of legalism, diplomacy, or recognition of de facto international reality. At independence, India inherited an Anglophone bureaucratic diplomatic culture rooted in the Indian civil service tradition. Admittedly, this encouraged a state-centric worldview in which sovereignty and legitimacy were treated within a very pragmatic framework. That, of course, helped recognize the effective control that the Chinese Communist Party had come to establish over the immediate post-Cold War, post-war years over China, culminating, of course, in the 1949. If this was a procedurally orthodox approach, I feel it had nothing to do with the colonial legacy as such. While Britain itself had delayed recognition under American pressure, India acted early, decisively, and very self-consciously, underscoring our capacity, as it were, for independent judgment. The central influence of this development was, of course, Jawaharlal Nehru. Nehru's worldview was explicitly anti-imperial. He understood the Chinese Communist victory as the culmination of a nationalist struggle rather than merely an extension of Soviet power. Recognition of the People's Republic of China was thus framed as an assertion of Asian political equality and a rejection of Western tutelage. It also reinforced India's non-aligned posture by distancing New Delhi from the US-led containment policies. All too often, especially on India-China policy, we notice that Nehru sometimes recoiled almost intuitively from the advice proffered to him by the mandarins of the ICS and to veer towards the impulses of the Congress leaders and others like K.M. Panikkar. This was also seen with respect to the founding years of the UN and even in terms of the representation and discussions at the United Nations before its founding, the discussions on the Charter. While it is true that strategic calculation shaped this decision, and in the fluid early Cold War year environment, our nationalist leaders in India hoped that early engagement would moderate Chinese behavior in Tibet and facilitate peaceful management of the Himalayan frontier. Recognition was a conscious strategic bet, not a colonial reflex, I think. The colonial inheritance mattered only indirectly. This calculation fostered confidence in diplomacy and moral legitimacy, encouraged civilizational readings of China while marginalizing military assessments. Of course, this latter factor contributed to our underestimation of the coercive logic of the communist state under Mao Zedong. While these influences shaped India's early expectations, in retrospect, the problem lay less in recognition than in our somewhat naive belief that the provision of legitimacy would yield restraint on the part of Communist China's early leaders. But India's choice was consciously post-colonial and autonomous, even though it may have been also unrealistically optimistic. Today, as against this conventional wisdom, it would appear that our speakers, both our speakers, of course, today only one will be speaking, want to present to us a much more differentiated, if not alternate view, a view that may appear somewhat counterintuitive and intellectually challenging to the more dogmatic Nehruvians amongst us. But this view emanates from a study which posits that India's alignment with other Commonwealth countries in recognizing China was, quote, largely dictated by British strategic interests which favored maintaining distance from China, unquote. According to this perspective, India's China policy was primarily driven by a consensus among the Indian foreign policy establishment to adhere to British policy directives. It also asks subsequently to what extent the change in India's governance structure and the significant shift in the identity of its chief policymaker following independence overcame the colonial influence in its China policy. The speakers seek to argue as we are led to believe, that the history of colonialism significantly influenced policy outcomes in the initial years following India's independence. How far is this perspective really true? Or is it just a matter of nuance? Did the leaders of New India seek to blaze an entirely new track from the convening of the Asian Relations Conference and following that in our policies towards our Afro-Asian neighbors, most prominently in recognizing the new PRC? Or were they following in the footsteps of a colonialist structural logic? For me, it was perhaps true that during the early years of independence, on the most pressing issue of aggression in J&K, and on taking that issue to the UN, we did somewhat lamely follow the lead of the colonial powers, almost in an act of faith in that new organization. But on independent India's People's Republic of China recognition policy, I just wonder. Now we have to bring this position clearly to, we have, of course, our principal speaker today is Dr. Atul Bharadwaj. Of course, Dr. Mohammed Chengez was also supposed to speak, but he has been unwell and therefore he will just attend this meeting and perhaps make some comments after Dr. Bharadwaj does. As you have been informed, Atul Bharadwaj is an ex-naval aviator currently working with the USI. He was earlier at the Teenmurti and the ICSSR and holds a master's degree on war studies from King's College London. He is now with the City University, I understand, of New London. He has, of course, a good record of research engagements. Dr. Mohammed Chengez Khan, Dr. Chengez Khan was is assistant professor at CCRC at the Jamia Millia. And I hope he will also be able to present some comments. We are looking forward, Dr. Bharadwaj, to hearing from you in more detail this particular challenging, as it were, of the conventional wisdom. I'm putting it perhaps a little too archly. Perhaps the actual thing is less dramatic. But let us see how your arguments work out in terms of the British colonial influence, British influence on India's recognition of the PRC. After around, perhaps we can probably give you around 25 minutes, and then we can have a round of discussions before we wrap up. I hope that is fine with Anne Varghese. If that is so, I would like to ask Dr. Bharadwaj to take the floor. You have the floor, Dr. Bharadwaj.
Thank you, Ambassador Nambiar. To begin with, I must also pay homage to Ambassador Bhasin for tremendous historical work that he has done, and which has helped so many of us, in understanding the period that he's extensively, documented. Today, to begin with, I must say I apologize that Chingez is not well enough to speak. And although Chingez, if you could unmute yourself and at least say hello to us, we would be grateful to you. And and so we're basically examining what the colonial shadow, and we're trying to re-examine India's recognition of communist China in 1949. My interest in this is that I find, this is my view basically, that a lot of our historiography is devoid of international context. So whenever we are discussing any historical event or episode for that matter, we tend to overlook the international context in that thing, and that really basically doesn't give us a complete picture of what exactly happened in that particular period. So if we now looked at the Sino-Indian War of 62, actually, often which serves as the definitive rupture in India-China relations, and casting a very long kind of a shadow on the relationship. However, to view the early diplomatic engagements between independent India and the newly formed People's Republic of China solely through the prism of 62 is to miss a critical and a more nuanced chapter in history. As scholar Vineet Thakur argues, in its post-independence foreign policy, India deliberately projected itself as a continuous international entity rather than radically new one. So thus consciously choosing to continue the colonial legacy of foreign policy frameworks and strategic networks. Now, this self-fashioning is strikingly illustrated in India's decision to recognize the PRC on December 30th, 1949. It was a pivotal move, which is traditionally attributed to Jawaharlal Nehru, his idealistic vision of the Asian solidarity. However, a closer examination of the archival records reveals a more complex driver, and that is the profound and the lingering influence of British colonial policy and personnel on India's nascent foreign policy establishment. Far from a clean break signaling an independent worldview, the decision was a manifestation of this continuation, adopting strategic logic shaped by London amidst competing Anglo-American visions of post-war Asia. So to begin with, I would first, give a brief timeline of the events and the Anglo-American divide on this particular question of recognition of China as such. So we see that in early January 1949, London approaches Washington and discusses and says that the threat a communist China would pose to the Western interests. So London is more bothered about the changes in China. On 24th 1949, Dean Acheson, the US Secretary of the State, he says, let's follow a wait and watch policy. Basically, he says, wait until the dust had settled. Basically, because the civil war is still undecided in early 1949. So Washington did not want to see the communists in power, but however, they have reconciled to the fact that the continued aid to Chiang Kai-shek would be absolutely ineffective. And they were also thinking of developing some alternatives. So the US National Security Council report, basically of February 1949, clearly stated, and I quote it here, the communists have shattered, although they have not yet completely destroyed the power of the national government. The document contemplated alternatives to the communists and stated, and I quote it here, we shall be seeking to discover, nourish, and bring to power a new revolution, which may eventually have to come to the test of arms with the Chinese. If it cannot, in the meantime, so modify the composition and character of the Chinese communists that they become a truly independent government, existing in an amicable relation with the world community. Primarily, America had reconciled to the fact that Chiang Kai-shek had lost. However, they wanted to bring about a new revolution to weaken the communists further. So this was the normal strategic thinking which was going on within America. By May 49, the Western Council journals were actively advising their governments the power was now in the grasp of communists in China, basically, the Mao Zedong forces. And the straight thinking actually suggested, they were saying that the Chinese communists were orthodox and they would align with Russia. So this was the basic fear, that these Chinese communists would be doing that. And this is, I'm talking of May 1949. And if you see in March already, the British Foreign Secretary Bevin had told the cabinet that there were no indication that the Chinese communists would pursue policies different from those followed by the communists elsewhere. And Washington was told accordingly that Britain did not want to appear unduly precipitate in recognizing the communist regime. At the end of June, if you see 1949, the feeling in the Far Eastern Department in London was that neither Mao nor the Communist Party were fellow Titos. So this term I'll explain, Tito. They were clear that the absence of overt Russian assistance was not a sign of potential Titoism, quote unquote. The Chinese Communist Party was one of the first to support the Communist Information Bureau resolution against Tito, because this is the evidence that they cited, that the Chinese are going to follow what the Russian line, because they had actually not supported Tito. So let's explain this term Titoism as such. The term Titoism became famous after Joseph Stalin and Joseph Broz Tito of Yugoslavia denounced each other's communist parties and parted ways in 1948. From then on, Tito, a professed communist, got closer to the US and other Western powers. Both the British and Americans, in a way, expected Mao to behave like Tito and to get away. So Nixon is often Nixon and Kissinger are often credited for the Sino-Soviet split, but the very idea of Sino-Soviet split, was being discussed in 1949 itself when the Chinese communists were about to take over. And the thought that Mao is more of a nationalist than a communist was prevalent in the Western circles. Now, it's not that Nehru was not aware of the Anglo-American grand strategy of causing this kind of a Sino-Soviet split. Now, in early 53, a letter by US diplomat Chester Bowles to the US President and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles said that the basic objective of our foreign policy should be to bring a rift between Soviet Union and Communist China. Bowles had spoken about this objective to Nehru also, who was convinced that this was necessary to avoid a third world war. And Nehru was the protagonist of the view that China is Asian first and communist next. He held the belief that if the non-socialist countries extend contact with China, she might become more independent of the Soviets. And one of the reasons, actually, if you see, for bringing in China for Bandung conference given by the British was also that the nationalist movements have in most of the newly independent countries then were by and large in South Asia, in fact, were evolutionary, whereas the Chinese nationalist movement was more revolutionary. So basically, bringing China in was to moderate them, to moderate their behavior in international context. And there were many others who suggested, like Edgar Snow and others, who suggested that Mao's communisms had sources other than Marxism-Leninism, but they were dismissed by London. So, in fact, what at that stage, London regarded them as eccentric nuisance. Basically, all those who even suggested that Mao is going to be different. And then from 8th October onwards, you see the US State Department held a China roundtable in which the British Foreign Secretary Bevin presented his case for abandoning Chiang Kai-shek in favor of Mao Zedong. He favored giving recognition to China and seating it in the United Nations. However, America differed with Britain on the timing of building diplomatic ties with Red China. And the two agreed to disagree and pursue independent China policy. So let me now come to the American policy on China during these years. The loss of China to communists will now work, and it was felt that they would now work as a junior partner of the Soviet Union, had tremendous repercussions throughout the world. And this was expected to have tremendous repercussions throughout the world. Now, it has marked a shift in the balance of power in favor of Soviet Union, this was felt. And this would be adversarial to the US strategic interests. The US State Department's China White Paper of August 49 asserted that the communist regime serves not Chinese interests, but those of the Soviet Russia. The American accommodation with China was prevented by political pressures from Congress, public opinion, and ideological considerations. George Kennan, in fact, stressed the American foreign policy experts to detach themselves from the ideological dogma and to grasp the reality of the international affairs. However, the fact was that since the US had invested heavily in Chiang Kai-shek, nationalist party, and were driven by the Cold War containment dogma, advocated a policy of non-recognition and isolation of China. The Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, argued that recognition would merely reward aggression. So they wanted to distance themselves from China at that stage. Britain, however, assessed the situation through a different lens. According to Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, uh, the British policy was one of containment and compromise, not containment and confrontation. And what compelled the British at that stage was their commercial interests in China. Their basic interest was to safeguard Hong Kong, and therefore they adopted a more pragmatic assessment of communist permanence. London moved towards recognition. This created a direct Anglo-American confrontation over China, with both powers vying to sway other nations, particularly the newly independent nations. So this was the policy difference which emerged between the Americans and the British at this stage. And one of the big questions which divided them was how to deal with China. British, of course, I would summarize, had their own commercial interests in Hong Kong. Their property was assessed in 1949 to be worth about 300 million pounds, British sterling pounds. And this is after incurring all the wastages during the war. So this kind, and they did not want to lose Hong Kong in any case with the British. So they were very, very firm on how to handle China differently. So it was a sort of, if you see, the Anglo-American policy was a carrot and stick policy which they adopted. The Americans trying to put pressure on China, and the British trying to offer them some softs. The British community and consular officers were advised to stay put in China, whereas Americans said that we would leave China uh, to basically avoid any demoralizing effect on Hong Kong and the rest of the area which they controlled. The grant of recognition was dependent on how the communists, however, they said how the communist government would behave. It would certainly not be given. The British argued in front of the Americans basically that they would certainly not give the recognition to China if they did not behave properly and if they did not, accept their international obligations. However, the British felt that the American policies of public condemnation of communists and maintaining diplomatic links with the Chiang Kai-shek party in Taiwan and supporting the blockade of Shanghai were further alienating China. British didn't want this because they were negotiating with Mao Zedong, and they felt that this basically put them in a tight spot. So if we consider the factors which led to recognition of by the Britain was that they were trying to manage this whole affair in a more diplomatic manner. On one hand, America is putting pressure. On the other hand, Britain is employing more and more diplomacy. Initially, they did also send a ship, basically a warship, which was attacked by the communists sometime in April, and the British withdrew that after that. So this was the state of this is the international context which I have tried to enumerate before we come down to India. Why India took that particular decision? So India found itself at the center of this diplomatic context, if you see. As Ambassador Vijay Gokhale has noted in his book Crosswinds, Britain saw India's stance as critical, basically, fearing that if Americans convinced Nehru, other Asian and Commonwealth countries might follow suit, leading to the possible collapse of the British policy. So they may have lost Hong Kong had they not been able to garner the support of the Indians. The US, aware of India's moral stature, also made direct appeals. However, they were meek, basically, because they were. I feel they were in a tacit understanding with London on this particular issue. So in October 49, the American officials did present Delhi with a detailed aid memoir and outlining 4 principles for the recognition, emphasizing that the haste was unnecessary and that communism posed a shared threat. This presented India with a clear choice between the British path of engagement and the American strategy of isolation. The Britain's influence was exerted not through blunt pressure, of course, but through deep channels within the Indian policy apparatus. And a key conduit was in this particular thing was India's ambassador to China, K.M. Panikkar. Now, archival documents show that Panikkar's views were heavily shaped by his conversations with British diplomats, particularly Ambassador Sir Ralph Stevenson. And Panikkar became a vocal critic of the American Cold War and anti-Soviet considerations, arguing that any alignment with Washington would convince Beijing that we are allowing ourselves to be used for furtherance of American interest. His dispatches, which held great sway with Nehru, consistently echoed the British line. Now, I insist here the British line basically because a lot of times in India, when assessing Panikkar, we think that he was more cordial with the Chinese Communist Party, and we blame him for that. However, if you look at it from this particular perspective, he was actually pushing the British policy line more rather than being closer to the communists, or rather than pushing the or batting for China for that matter, for Mao's China for that matter. And simultaneously, Britain carefully managed its communications with both India and America. So this is more important because to the Americans, British officials suggested that India was acting unilaterally, inclined to accord a de facto recognition, to downplay their own kind of, the kind of games that they were playing in this entire drama. To the Indians, the Britishers said that the American resolve, hinting that Washington's opposition was softening and that recognition was inevitable. So to the Indians, they told that Americans would eventually soften their stance towards China. As Krishna Menon reported from London, Foreign Secretary Bevan told Acheson that Britain was under pressure to recognize owing to the attitude of India, a clever inversion of causality. Now, this calibrated diplomacy successfully created an echo chamber in Delhi where British rationale appeared more prudent and ironically aligned with the future American pivot, basically, towards China. So this could have been, since this is still a work in progress, therefore, we are trying to gather more inputs on this. And I'm sure this discussion would definitely help us, to refine our arguments a little bit more. So recognition dates, if one goes by, is that on the 1st January 1949, India recognized China. On 4th January, Pakistan did this. On 6th January, Britain did this. On 7th January, Sri Lanka. So before India, a day before India, Burma had done this. So the entire Commonwealth, minus New Zealand and Australia, had recognized China. So it is sometimes, it is wrong to say that Nehru was over enthusiastic and we were the first ones to recognize China. In fact, the entire Commonwealth countries recognized China. So India wanted its decision, basically. Why India did it on 1st and Britain did on 6th and the others did little later, primarily because India wanted its decision to look independent and not as a diktat from Britain. Nehru wrote, and very clearly he wrote, that our decision will be our own, though of course we should consult others. For us to take any action in the wake of Commonwealth Foreign Ministers Conference, apart from delay involved, would also mean that we could not act independently. This might well affect our position in China, unquote. So Nehru was very clear that there was a Commonwealth Foreign Ministers Conference which was due in Sri Lanka. So he wanted to recognize China a day before, or before, so that his decision appeared independent. Now, the pros and cons of advanced recognition by India were analyzed by Peter Scarlett of the China Department in London. Now, Scarlett believed that India's action would break the ice on recognition as far as the US was concerned and make subsequent recognition by us and others much easier. So basically, you're saying if India had done this, then then we can also say that we also need to do this. This is an inevitable. So that was the logic which he gave. The disadvantage, he says, would be that it would add communist prestige in Southeast Asia. It might be interpreted as recognition by Asiatics as distinct from Western imperialism. So therefore, the emphasis that Asia is doing this, and Asia is emerging from the shadows of Western imperialism, and that's because the entire idea of Indian nationalism, which you see, was based on opposition to Western imperialism. Therefore, India never wanted to look closer to Britain in this thing, and we wanted to project our decision as independent. Another evidence of the British influence, if you see, was in October 1950. A delegate of El Salvador asked for inclusion of the invasion of Tibet by foreign forces on the UN General Assembly's agenda. The United Nations discussed the issue on 24th November 1950, and the British wanted the matter to be settled amicably between the parties concerned. Their delegate proposed that the UN General Assembly defer the decision on the question of invasion of Tibet. That's the British position. So Jam Sahib, the Indian delegate at the United Nations, supported Britain's proposal to postpone the Tibet item sine die. Sahib told the United Nations that the Indian government was anxious to settle the dispute peacefully because it had friendly relations with both its neighbors, China and Tibet. Here he clearly, mentioned that Tibet was a separate entity than China. However, he supported again that British decision in the United Nations. In November 49, if you see, KP Menon informed Frank Roberts, the British ambassador in India, that they had no intention of raising Tibet issue with China because it was presumed that China would respect all treaties. However, he was also aware that the problem was that even the nationalists had not recognized the 1914 Shimla Agreement. So there was no way to expect the communists to come and respect that particular agreement. So it was sort of decided in the foreign ministry that the raising the issue at the time of recognition would unnecessarily raise controversies and will prove counterproductive. So therefore, it was decided to engage with China and raise the issue later, something which suited again the British policy and was much in agreement with the British policy. If you see the files very clearly, KPS Menon and Girija Shankar Bajpai, who were the two main protagonists in this entire episode, were basically arguing on the British lines that engaging with China is important to bring them away, to wean them away from the Soviet Union, and to moderate their behavior in international politics. Reasons behind again Nehru's policy was aware that in the communist world he was increasingly seen as an agent of the West. So Nehru wanted to dispel this particular notion. And mind you, one important fact of the matter was that our relations with Russia in that particular phase, till Stalin was alive, were not very good. In fact, Stalin had refused to meet our ambassador Vijay Lakshmi Pandit when she was posted there. So it is very clearly that this is the stage where Nehru is not in good terms with the communists. And Nehru wanted to project himself as an autonomous actor and a neutral leader. First, and one reason was, again, I would say that this was in the British interest because he wanted to inspire the newly independent nations in Asia and Africa. And also he wanted to win the sort of confidence of China in order to effectively perform the role as a mediator. Both these roles suited the British foreign policy in the region as they went on to retain their heft in global affairs in the wake of steep decline in their imperial fortunes and the inevitable fall of their empire. It is naive to imagine that the British intelligence arm vanished into thin air after the 15th August 1947, and Nehru had absolute agency under his command to shape India's foreign policy. So this is what this paper basically disagrees with, that Nehru wanted to project himself as an autonomous and a neutral actor, but his his foreign policy was constrained by these international developments. Both these So, it is argued that, like Nirupama Menon has argued in her book, The Fractured Himalayas, that Nehru's own thinking provided fertile ground for this influence. Yes, one could agree with that. But the fact remains that, he had limited agency, I would say, very early on in our foreign policy, the development of our evolution of our foreign policy in the early years. And it is very clearly indicative here that our policy formulation was deeply interwoven with the British Council. And in this confidential note and recognition decision, Nehru specifically cited Panikkar and Stevenson as being anxious that recognition should be given as early as possible. The final timing just before the Commonwealth Foreign Conferences in Colombo was explicitly chosen on Panikkar's advice to project India's independence. So this is the broader thing that we are trying to bring about, that how the British were deeply involved in India's policy towards China, towards Communist China very early on. It's not that there was no opposition to Nehru's China policy. There was. We all know that Deputy Prime Minister Vallabhbhai Patel, in a private lunch, with the US chargé d'affaires, expressed deep concerns about the communist threat to Tibet and Southeast Asia. And he said that there was no need to hurry to recognize China. He later lamented that Nehru rushed recognition because British diplomats had convinced him the whole Western world would soon follow, a claim based on Britain's misleading assurances. Similarly, Foreign Secretary Girija Shankar Vajpayee, although he supported recognition of China, had warned that this may hurt our position on Kashmir in the UN Security Council. Now, these strategic and legal cautions were overridden in the process, and Ambassador Gokhale in his book has concluded these were discussed and decided upon within a closely held group of advisors around Nehru and in close consultations with Britain. So this has been brought about in his book by Ambassador Gokhale. Now, socialist leaders were again one of the early critiques of Nehru's foreign policy was the socialist leader Lohia. He wanted India to come out of the Commonwealth and follow the American lead on China. So there was now at this stage, there was definitely an American lobby within India, and which was opposing, Nehru's foreign policy, which was seen to be favoring, and which was actually, much in line with the British policy. He believed that Nehru was basically a British satellite, and this he said in 1950 to an American ambassador. And he would eventually join the Atlantic camp via the British subsection, but would do so only after having irritated and damaged the Americans. Probably he was right. This is exactly what happened. It is only after the Bandung Conference, it is only after about 1956-57, when Americans started getting directly involved in Tibet, that our foreign policy changes. So there are very two distinct, if one is assessing India's foreign policy and one takes the international context into consideration, then very clearly our policy till the Suez crisis is clearly favoring the British. And post-Suez, I would say, if one is to make that categorization, is basically, starts veering towards the kind of policy that the Americans are following on China. And eventually, we had a war in 62 based on that. Now, Americans also at that stage, it is very important to note the Americans did not want to put excessive pressure on India, especially after they had lost China in 1948, the communists. And one of the reasons which was given for losing China in America was that they had been Chiang Kai-shek was seen to be too close to America, a lackey of America, and which was sort of a position which was exploited by the communists to say that these nationalists are hardly nationalists in that terms. So, and Nehru's nationalism, which was based on on fight against Western imperialism, America did not want to put excessive pressure on him, so that to be seen closer to the Americans, who were in some ways more ways than one, seen as a part of the Western alliance in that sector. So while India's relation with China, again plummeted in late 50s, if you see, Britain continued to quote China. And I quote some figures here. 1958, the total exports to China from UK were 27 million as compared to 12 million in 1957. And this is a time when our problems with China are rising. Imports from China to UK were 19 million pounds, sterling pounds, in 1958 against 14 million sterling pounds in 1957. So the Labour Party produced a pamphlet, in its Looking Ahead series entitled China and the West. So they were still quoting China. They were still pursuing that policy of, dividing, of weaning China away from the Soviet Union. And this was a continuous process. On 8th February 1961, speaking in the House of Lords, Lord Douglas Holmes said, "The facts of the international life demanded Communist China be seated in the United Nations because without China, the disarmament negotiations were incomplete." So this was the position from the very beginning. So in conclusion, I would say that the episode underscores a vital yet often overlooked aspect of early Indian foreign policy, and that is the endurance of colonial era structures and thinking. The Indian Foreign Service and the Ministry of External Affairs were direct successors of the British Indian institutions. Key officials like KPS Menon were products of the old system. The strategic rationale India adopted, that recognition would prevent pushing China irrevocably into Soviet embrace, was a classical British wedge strategy, clung to even after Mao had declared his lean to one side policy. Recognition became, in effect, a procedural decision following a British led script rather than a hard nosed negotiation where India could have bargained, perhaps, for guarantees on critical issues, which I doubt, of course, on Tibet or on border agreements inherited from the British Raj. So, although would be difficult for India to achieve that at that early stages, as KPS Menon I mentioned had also suggested that this would be difficult and it would cause unnecessary controversies in the very beginning. In conclusion, India's recognition of PRC was a decision shaped by many factors. While Nehru's personal belief in Sino-Indian friendship and non-alignment provided the philosophical cover, the operational policy was decisively steered by the lingering framework of British strategic interests and diplomats who championed them. This was not a simple case of Nehru's naivety, idealism, or ideological predilections, but rather a testament to how shadow of colonialism extended into sovereign decision making of a new nation. With this, I would end, sir, and we would be open to question and answers.
Thank you. Thank you, Atul. That's a very interesting kind of complete kind of analysis you produced. Now, I was thinking just, for the discussion, I was wanting to suggest perhaps three major points, at least 3 or 4 major points you made in your presentation, which could be the focus of discussion, which views which people can in a sense focus on. One is, are you speaking of British influence on India's recognition, or is it Indian influence on British recognition or British policy towards new communist China? That is, it's a question of nuance, but it is really, this will see where the agency, it actually refers basically to agency. And the second point is, of course, is how limited was the agency of Jawaharlal Nehru in these decisions? Because the assumption you are making is that his agency was essentially limited. Third is how much of a creature of the, let's say, of the Western, let's say, colonial post sort of, or let's say the remnant influences of colonialism in terms of India policy towards China was Nehru representing. In fact, if you notice, as late as 1958, after the Tibet problems and India's, Mao's mentioned precisely this. He said that Nehru was actually the agent of British imperialism. And in fact, he was all the time just furthering, he followed completely in the footsteps of they were just a formal continuation. Now, for many of the people in India earlier, despite the fact that obviously there were differences between the major leaders, as you said, Vallabhbhai Patel and Nehru, but the Nehruvian stamp, as it were, on India's China policy, it was quite, how deep was it, and influenced it as it was by people like, as you said, the difference between the Panikkars, the fact that Panikkar had close consultations with British colonial in civil servants, etc., is undoubted. But the fact is, his ideological, how much was this particular policy, these policies of India based on the strong ideological kind of undergirdings that talked about Afro-Asian resurgence, Asianist agency, and how much China had already come to represent that from the point of view of one Asian power as compared to India, and how much of it was to be expected further in terms of its possible, of a China policy, China emerging out of the shadows, as it were, of its ideological association with the USSR. Clearly, that was also important in terms of India's overall, championing of the idea of non-alignment, of the resurgence of Afro-Asia, Panchsheel, and the Bandung, etc. You see, these were things which had appeared not just in the 50s, in the 40s, late 40s also this had appeared. In fact, the Asian Relations Conference China did participate also in that. There was problem about Tibet and all that. All these were there. But the fact that there were differences with regard to policies regarding Tibet, yes. And they were hoping, and it looked as if from Nehru's point of view, they wished to move, in a sense, a little away from the traditional, the policies of the British India during the 30s, 40s, and the 30s and the 40s, but granting that you are dealing with a new China. That obviously meant that you had to look at the whole Tibet question also from a different perspective. And these, of course, differences within India were there, but I don't think they were really, in a sense, shadow images of colonial policy. If they did, we did have to suffer the consequences and perhaps be influenced by the results of what was followed in earlier policies. But the fact is, I think there was some, particularly in terms of the border and things like that, there were very, very, very precise and very direct sort of measures taken in the early 50s, etc., by India in terms of the Himmat Singh sort of thing in Northeast, etc., with respect to the Nifa area. So all these things give the impression, give rise to a very interesting kind of question of whether it was really Indian policy that is influencing British China recognition policy, or are you talking of the British influence on India's China recognition policy? I think that is, it would be useful to find out what the exact how the balance is. It's obviously it's a question of nuance, and of course the question of Nehru. I'd like to perhaps we can open the thing for discussion and see how people would prevailing views. Let's say I'd ask Anna, could you check
If I
the...
could, or if I could briefly answer this, and then then maybe I'll be able to gather my thoughts.
Go ahead. Yes, please.
So your first question, are we speaking about the British influence or the Indian influence? So it is clearly the British policy, sir, primarily, because the British have interest to defend. At that stage, we have absolutely no interest to defend vis-a-vis China. The issue of Tibet is also a legacy left behind by the British for us, if we see in that sense. And they are basically concerned about Hong Kong and about their commercial interests. So we are clearly moving in that particular direction. So there is very little influence that we are having on Britain. In fact, Britain is, of course, happy to use us and to project us as a power, which is useful in Asia. And so therefore, it is primarily the British interest that we are talking and the British influence on us. If you could say influence, or we thought this is a common sense approach that we need to adopt at that stage. Our bureaucracy, our leadership at that stage thought that this is the best possible approach. What the British are saying is probably right, and what the Americans are saying, may not fit our kind of foreign policy at that stage. So there was a division, and the British, in fact, if you see, the British had gathered the entire Commonwealth. And it's not just India, which was, Pakistan was also doing. Pakistan, later became closer to the Americans and was in fact getting closer to the Americans at that stage. And similarly, you had Sri Lanka. Similarly, you had Burma. So all these countries basically, extended their support to China and in recognition to Britain, basically in recognizing China. So India was not alone in this sense. British was taking their entire Commonwealth along with them. And they were basically, when they were bargaining with China on Hong Kong and with Mao Zedong on Hong Kong and other issues, and while they were also, bargaining with the Americans on why they should continue to, disengage with the larger Western policy on China. So they were, the two appears to be absolutely at loggerheads on this. They were not, but I would suggest that there was a tacit understanding, and the Americans agreed for the British to follow a particular policy with regard to China because they had larger interests over there. So this was a larger Commonwealth policy rather than a Nehruvian policy, I would say. Now, Nehru had limited agency, and I said, yes, agency was limited because the entire Commonwealth was acting here. See, we only wanted to project ourselves not as a part of this decision. His decision was basically that it should not appear to be a Commonwealth decision. We sort of did it earlier because we wanted to show that we are independent primarily, and the British were also interested in projecting us as an independent power. This again, whenever we take the international context out of our arguments or from our history, what we miss out is that there were even the British, there were a lot of countries in Africa which had to become independent. British wanted to project India's example of nationalism as an evolutionary nationalism to the entire world. They wanted to project India was a showcase piece for them, to take it to Africa, and because since they didn't have credibility at all in Africa, the Americans had no credibility in Africa because they were following an absolutely racist policy in their own country. India was, in that sense, with an unblemished record, was a good example for them to approach, and because so that they didn't want these newly independent countries to move towards the Soviet camp. So that is one example why India and Nehru was important to both the Anglo-Americans in this particular phase. And that is the point that we often miss when even when we are interpreting the Bandung Conference, and we say that it was the Afro-Asian, assertion of the Afro-Asian rights. So we are this particular context of why this, and I mentioned in my talk also, why they wanted China to be included in Bandung Conference. The British wanted that to happen because they insisted that this was sort of moderate their kind of a revolutionary zeal, which is guiding the Chinese at that moment, and help them project as an Asiatic power rather than a communist bloc country. So they had their own access to grind in that particular space. So this international context is often missing in our in our approaches to understanding the historical events of that stage. How much of a creature Nehru was? Nehru, of course, there was, we need to deconstruct again non-alignment as such. Non-alignment, if you see, was is often explained in terms of it was maintaining equidistance or not being a part of any military alliance primarily. So militarily we were non-aligned, but politically I would argue that we were not non-aligned, because Nehru, for that matter, was wedded to the international liberal order. He was not a part of the communist bloc. So politically, we were definitely not aligned, while as militarily, yes, we were non-aligned. So we need to deconstruct this entire idea of non-alignment as well, and try to understand it of how these things have evolved over a period of time. And we, based on our internalist views, on our internalist statements of Nehru, it is very we've simplified non-alignment for that matter.
After all, decolonization is a big element, from that point of view.
So non-alignment.
Not Western. It was from that point of view. It was distinctly anti-West.
It was distinctly anti-West, but the anti-West, yet it had to be moderated. Like the way the British left India with grace, similarly they wanted to leave with grace from other countries as well, and they expected India to play a big role in helping them achieve that particular purpose. So that was one way of keeping India engaged in the global politics for them as such. The other, as far as Patel and Lohia was concerned, so there is again, I would say, a limited study. We are very clear on the communist influences in India, which were limited to the Communist Party of India and a few communists, basically. As I mentioned, that till 53, till Stalin's death, we did not have much engagement with Russia, for that matter, or the Soviet Union, for that matter. But there was an American lobby, certainly, which was coming up in India, and which played a huge role. If you see the, after once the Tibet flares up in mid 50s, and this is consisting largely of Lohias and socialists like Jayaprakash Narayan and other people. So there is another, one needs to study this particular lobby as well, to see its impact on India-China relations. And the British impact started declining after the Suez crisis, I say, and it is this lobby which takes over then and started exercising influence on our policy on China.
Good. And you can start the questions. You can probably from the chat box or.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. There are currently no questions in the chat box, but Shruti Jagad has raised her hand, so I think she wants to ask a question.
Okay.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks to the speaker. The lecture was very illuminating. And my question relates to something that Ambassador Nambiar also mentioned, and it's more methodological and theoretical. So here, if the main evidence is the consultation that the Indian officials then had with the British officials, then does this claim then apply to all of India's foreign policy decisions of that time and not just this decision on China? That all of it was influenced by, is that the implication that is being made in the paper, that all of it is influenced by the British? And if not, then do you explain in your paper that what explains alignment with the British on some policies and non-alignment on others, or what explains the success of British influence in some policies and not in others? Thank you.
To answer your question, yes, of course, the main evidence, of course, suggests that, I'm taking not the entire period of India's foreign policy. I'm taking India's foreign policy till the Bandung conference, if you would see. And I've clearly made a distinction that after the Bandung conference and later as Tibet starts flaring up in mid 50s, there is a perceptible shift in India's policy. And it is not at that stage the policy which is pursued by the British. As I've suggested, in 1958, Britain was the highest when our tensions with China was rising. Britain was the biggest trading partner of China, for that matter, in 1958. However, they were also allies with America. We must remember this. So India, it is particularly, I have focused myself on this particular policy on China's recognition. And later, if you see, as I've been alluding to, the fact that the British influence continued even for the Bandung conference. The British were interested in the Bandung conference in that sense. And uh, and if you see, Churchill after the Bandung conference clearly stated, something I'm not quoting exactly, but he told Vijay Lakshmi Pandit that Nehru was the leading light of Asia. And Churchill talking about Nehru in that sense, and he says he's a bigger god than Buddha or something like that. He said, this is what he quoted to Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. So in that sense, India, particularly on China, is following that particular policy. And on other issues, if you see, and so therefore, it is very easy to say that Krishna Menon was or Panikkar was anti-American. So the moment you say he was an anti-American, it is assumed that he was closer to the Soviets. So it is not that. Once you dig deeper into the archives, you will find that the policies that they were advocating may not have been exactly pro-Soviet, but they could have been Britain also. So that is those nuances we do not make when we are sort of digging into histories, and that is why it is important to so look at these nuances basically. And especially on our foreign policy, we cannot you say if we followed this policy in 1950 early 50s, we continue to follow the same policies even later. No, there was an absolute break in 1955-56, I would say, when the Americans start to intervene directly in Tibet. And that's the stage when our policy starts shifting. Next question.
Professor Alka Acharya would also like to ask a question.
Sorry, okay.
Okay.
Sorry, just muted. So, okay, now this is going to be slowly put because I'm trying to formulate my question as I'm trying to grapple with what appears to me a somewhat contradictory notion that on the one hand, you have a Nehruvian worldview shaped by a very, very strong sense of the history of Asia. And there is plenty of evidence to show that this Asia that he had in mind was something which included China. That China would not obviously be outside this vision in which China and India, and of course there were other countries as well, but these were the two leading civilizational states and so on. So in one sense, his Asian perspective was very substantially rooted in his idea of Asia. And this idea was informed by the histories over centuries. Okay. On the other hand, you have him also, obviously, I mean, there's no, trying to skip around this issue. He was not a communist sympathizer by any means. And socialism, but not communism. I mean, we can say that, and just purely for argument's sake, without getting into the nuances here. But frankly, his view of China also had a very strong realist kind of a strain. And we have heard this statement that he made to this delegation of journalists, which went on a tour of Southeast Asia. And he's telling them before they go that the India-China challenge runs across the spine of Asia. So he's very well versed with the realities of the contradictions and the fault lines within this Asian romanticism, if you will, and his sense that, you know, India also had a huge number of challenges. So all these things which go into his worldview, the non-alignment, which actually was a way to navigate the capitalist economy at that point of time and try and see how to expand India's options in terms of economic development and modernization. His idea of Asia, where China had a role, but conscious of the fact that this was now a new power emerging. So I am just trying to see why would it become more of an influence of, say, the Anglo or the American perspective. It could well be his own way of navigating the multiple challenges, which hewed a bit closer to, say, the British line at that point of time. And then, as you say, that by Bandung we see a change. So it's obviously a question of how carefully you are formulating policy at a time when the Cold War had broken out in full swing. So I don't know whether you have got where I'm trying to get you, but
No. I agree with you. It's not that Nehru was absolutely being driven like that. It's not that absolutely. I don't say that Nehru was being driven. Nehru was Nehru was one of the most erudite leaders that we've ever had, and in that sense, he was pretty aware of what is happening. He was being briefed by everyone, and he was taking a brief from everyone. So it is not that. And Nehru, as I said, was definitely a liberal in that sense. He was a lot of people call him socialist. He was definitely not a socialist, but I would term he was a New Dealer. And the term which the American, closer to the American progressives and to the Fabians than ever to the communists. So he was very, very clear on that particular aspect. However, you say, and he had a vision of Asia, but if you see this, his vision of Asia was something which was, very similar to the ideas of the British on China. The British had sold the idea to the Americans that they need to recognize China and they need to be closer to China and they need to have a foothold in communist China, largely because they wanted to get them away from the Soviet bloc. So to get them away from the Soviet bloc, it was important to have them within the Asian fold. And Nehru's views on a larger Asia fitted into that particular, vision of Britain as well. So both sort of coincided, and that's why. And if you see, the Americans also didn't insist on Nehru on following their policy on China during the initial stages. Although the American lobby in India did protest against Nehru's policy, but they were not really insisted on India because they had actually left India to be dealt with by Britain in the early years because they were busy both in Korea and Japan, and they did not have really time to invest on India. And therefore, it was a very clear-cut policy decision that the Britain was sort of, looking after this India, South Asia region. And the British were fulfilling that particular role. So therefore, it is easier and it is good from a nationalistic perspectives to imagine that we had absolute agency. But, when we dig deeper into the international context and try to understand that particular situation, then things look a little bit different. So there was convergence, of course, with the Britishers, and that convergence among our bureaucracy also, because obviously, it is difficult to disentangle so early on, because after all, they had been, interacting with the British for such a long time. And so it is rather difficult for them to, imagine a different or develop an absolutely different worldview, immediately after the British had left. So one would not really say that they were just towing the British line. It is just that they thought that that was the best possible approach at that stage. And
there's one point on this point, if I may interrupt you. Should I
yes,
ask you a
please, sir.
question on this? You see, this is also the time when the Baghdad Pact and the CETO were also being discussed at the early. And would you be saying that there was any gap between the UK and the US points of view on these kind of treaties, which India was so clearly opposed to? Was there any sort of space between the UK and the US? And would you think that was also part of a kind of a British colonial influence still kind of being reflected in India's response to the Baghdad and the India's response? This was immediately around the time of immediately post the Bandung.
I'm not really studied this particular dimensions of the Anglo-American, discord or understanding on this Baghdad Pact and CETO. This is an interesting question, of course, and of course, the policy vis-a-vis Pakistan was absolutely different. Of course, in recognition case, they took the entire Commonwealth along with them, to show that they were still powerful. But of course, on the Baghdad Pact and the other things, as they were dividing Asia, I'm not too sure on that particular aspect, sir. I would not venture, because I've not really studied the Anglo-Americans' approaches in this particular segment. But of course, they were, like I said, they were clearly following this particular line that they have to split China from Soviet Union. That was their ultimate grand strategy of the Western grand strategy primarily.
That's true.
So,
Another point, if I may, just one more point, if I may. Are you closing?
No. I was just posing another question in the chat box.
Okay, you go ahead. After that, I'll ask you. Okay, go ahead.
No, sir, please go ahead. We can ask the question.
Okay, that is one. The other point which I would want to, which is again very difficult to, in a sense, to even articulate, is if we had so much of, and it is clear even from the documents that India's, particularly on the border, the policies were so much in continuation after independence from some of the perceptions of pre-independent times, and also the influence of people like Sir Girja Shankar Vajpayee and others on the thinking. Yet you found independent India did not seem to adopt the kind of pragmatic, practical kind of approaches vis-a-vis border settlement. As how would you say that British influence on that was, particularly that aspect of our policies vis-a-vis China not working out?
So if you actually see, again, I come back before the mid-50s, there is absolutely no problem in the sense that there is between India and China on the border issue. We signed the agreement in 1954, the Tibet Accord, the trade deal that we signed with China in 1954. And then, and there is no issue of, we are still aware, there are some paper clippings which clearly show that there is a road being made in Aksai Chin and we are aware of that. There are some people.
No, but the entire negotiations in 54, we were actually, it was very strong negotiations, and we gave in.
So that's exactly I'm saying, sir. So we put a flag in Arunachal Pradesh and in Tawang region, and the Chinese do not oppose it. The only thing that the Chinese do at that stage is that they encourage some Tibetans to put up some posters in Tibet, with regard to that. Beyond that, they do not go. So there is no disagreement on Tawang. There is no disagreement on Aksai Chin till there.
Yes.
All these problems, and there is no absolutely narrative there is no narrative that India is an answer to China, or India is a counterpose to China. So there is absolutely no argument till the Bandung conference, and Bandung conference is very successful in that respect. And so there is an inclusion of China in the Asian, sphere basically, and they're not seen as antagonistic to the Asian sphere.
Yes.
Post the Americans coming into the area, you see a distinct shift in their narratives when they start projecting India as a counterpose, Indian democracy as a counterpose to the to the Chinese communist regime. And when this entire narrative of competition between the two starts, competition and the issue of the borders. So in that sense, if you see, till the time the British influence remains, we are primarily at peace with China, and that is the phase of Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. The problems begin to appear later. And I'm not saying that all the maps which are provided for that problems to rise were also coming exactly from Britain, exactly, Escopal and others who go there.
Yes.
So it's not that they're playing both ways in that sense, and as any great power would do. So that is a position that So we need to look at this. We need to break up this entire 1950s and see them separately to really make a larger picture of the whole.
Okay. Very, very, very interesting viewpoint. Yes. Go ahead, Dan.
Yes, sir. There's a question by Nazar Khan who asks, what is the influence of Bandung Conference on China's policy on India?
The China's policy on India till then was very much okay. Cordiality was there in the relationship between the two countries. In fact, in the Bandung Conference happens. There is Chow Enlai is supposed to come in an aeroplane, which is the Kashmir Princess. It's an Air India plane called Kashmir Princess, and the plane crashes. And the Chow Enlai has not actually boarded the plane because there isn't some intelligence inputs which he receives that there could be some problem. That plane crashes and about 13 people die in it, and the Indian crew of 6 basically survives in this plane crash in Indonesia. So it begins like this. Yet the trust levels are not broken. The trust levels between India and China remain. Bandung Conference, again, I would say that you have to assess it both from the Indonesian perspective also. It's very important that the role the Indonesians played in conducting at that particular conference and what sort of political gains they were trying to extract. Even Indonesians, in fact, the Bandung Conference was actually proposed by the Indonesians. It was held on April 18th, which was the date of the inaugural date of the conference was decided in consultation with the American embassy, and the April 18th was the date of the date of the American Revolution actually. So it was decided accordingly from that perspective, and Indonesians also started getting closer to China after the Bandung Conference basically. So the Americans did not even oppose that.
This was also the time when Krishna Menon was negotiating with the Chinese for the release of American prisoners of war.
Yes, sir. He in fact, he got the Air Force, the American Air Force pilots, basically.
Yes, absolutely.
And so that's why I am sort of again and again, arguing that we need to break this entire period up into, 2 parts to understand, what exactly was happening. And any other question?
Yes, sir. There's a question by Rapai Malyakal, who thanks you for the presentation and asks, how big of a factor was Hong Kong and British interest in the making of overall China policy at that point?
It was absolutely that, basically the entire policy revolved around Hong Kong. America wanted to make it a free port. The British opposed it. The British didn't want to give it. He said it will be under international arbitration or it will be under international controls. The British said, no, nothing doing it. We will maintain it. And they were negotiating separately with Mao Zedong on that particular issue. So that was the central part of their policy.
There are currently no more questions in the chat box. If you have any other statements or comments you'd like to make.
Well, I don't know if Mr. with Muhammad Chengiz Khan, would he like to make some closing comments, or would he prefer, as he said that he would prefer not to make any comments, is it?
Is he there? Chingiz, are you there? I think he's unwell, so probably
Okay.
he's left.
Okay.
Or something.
Well, there is, is this, would you like to make some concluding comments, Atul?
Thank you, sir. I think I have said more than enough.
Well, yeah. No, this has been a fascinating discussion as far as I can see, because it's actually verges, it's basically hinges on nuance to a very large extent. And, and without really necessarily, in a sense, detracting or lessening in any way the enormous influence which a person like Pandit Nehru did exercise in the early years of our independence in terms of creating crafting India's international outlook, despite the fact that there was a certain continuity in the Foreign Office all through. There was at the same time, one would say, there was also an emerging kind of worldview which the Congress and Congress leaders in general, and the Nehru in particular, along with his close coterie of political advisors, had made. This is very clear, but it was in a sense a kind of a pas de deux of these two influences. On the one hand, the Foreign Office, strong Foreign Office influences of the political department, right from the Foreign Secretary, then subsequently Secretary General and Foreign Secretary KPS Menon. All of them had major contributions to make, which was really in line with the continuity of the political department of the previous year. There's no question about that. But it was clear that even for them, they had to, in a sense, reinvent, or not so much reinvent as reclothe that kind of thing in the vestments of the new worldview which Nehru had clearly identified, which a large part of which was the new Asian identity, the new Afro-Asian identity, and most of it, much of it at least, was centered on India and China as major civilizational influences, along with major other important countries like Indonesia, etc., and the emerging Indochina. It's clear that all these were very important influences in policy. And the fact that this was at a time when, on the one hand, there was very strong kind of, let's say, stake, a very strong stake which India had in China emerging as from the shadows of any other international, or particularly from the USSR, but as a kind of an important representative in its own right of Asia as a civilization, as one of the biggest big civilizational entities in Asia, and asserting its own influence in the region. But more important than that, in the process, avoiding a global catastrophe, which was actually in the shape of a nuclear kind of. This is where, though China was not a nuclear power till the early 60s, there was the danger of the China problem resulting in a kind of in the aggravation of bloc rivalries between the USSR and the US, and resulting in nuclear sort of in escalation, especially during the Korean War and things like that. The fact that China had asserted itself very strongly in the Korean War was a very clear indication that in terms of its own national kind of interests, there would be no outside influence which would be more important to China than its own. And that, I think, came out across very clearly, even into countries like India, and India's role in some of the in the amelioration of some of the tensions during the Korean War was something which the Chinese had really very had depended upon to a very great extent and were very grateful to also. The same was also being slowly being expressed in Indochina, where the Chinese were increasingly depending on Krishna Menon and on Nehru to help in sort of in defusing some of the tensions that were caused in Indochina. All these things during the 50s were very important elements of an emerging relationship, which was actually, on the one hand, it was clearly there was the influence of the British kind of the residual influences of the colonial policy, which had characterized India's foreign policy. But I think it was a little more than that. And I think it's a question, as you said, of nuance. And it is important to recognize that while it was clear that there was, particularly in the early 50s, as you were saying, British interests in maintaining a kind of a slow kind of deceleration, as it were, of the process of decolonization. It was done without hastening any instability, process of gradual evolution rather than revolution, as you said, and at the same time keeping its essential kind of interests, particularly in Hong Kong, because I think there were huge commercial interests which were still tied to Hong Kong, which were important. And secondly, vestigial and important, nevertheless, commercial influences and stakes in the China trade, which was for a long time it was very largely one which the UK was very dependent upon. And of course, very soon after McCarthy years after the Korean War, it was clear increasingly it became important for the United States to take a much more active policy, and that's when things started changing. And then, of course, the various treaty, sort of the Seattle and Baghdad Pact and things like that came. And then, of course, as you said, the Suez and post-Suez developments. But this is a very interesting period, and to see the exact interplay of what you may call British interests, on the one hand, contending with American interests, and second, on the other hand, the British interest mingling with the Commonwealth and trying to influence the Commonwealth towards a slow, progressive policy of working with the countries of the region in both in decolonization and in preventing instability from taking over in Southeast Asia and in the Middle East. These are important elements. In fact, it's interesting that this was also the time when progressively in the Middle East things were changing. The British influence in the crucial states in West Asia was also slowly changing, as you note, and this is very interestingly explained in Sam Dalrymple's book called The Shattered Empire, Shattered Empire, something like that. Very interesting developments that had taken place. I think it's interesting that you, Atul, and Mohammad Chingiz are taking so much of a granular interest in details of the foreign policy documents in the colonial in Whitehall, etc., as well as in Indian archives to throw a lot more light into some of the details of how these developments took place during that time. I think it will be something which people will, which scholars will certainly be very interested in, and you will be remembered for that. Thank you very much for this evening. I don't know if there's any further comments which anybody would like to make. I would like to now hand over to Anne Varghese to complete the formalities. It's been an excellent discussion, at least your explanation from your point of view. Thank you.
And if I may add one or two lines. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for your comments, and I'm sure we'll incorporate it in our work.
Namaskar.
And,
Thank you.
this has been most valuable discussion, of course.
Yes.
And thank you, Alka, and thank you, ICS, for hosting us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I think with that, we'll probably close the meeting. It's almost 4:40 now. Okay. Thank you. All the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ambassador Nambiar. I now seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
With
Right.
this, we come to an end of today's seminar. We thank our speakers, Dr. Atal Bhardwaj and Dr. Mohammad Chingiz Khan, as well as our chair, Ambassador Vijay K. Nambiar, for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. The video for today's seminar shall be available on the ICS YouTube channel. We extend a warm invitation to all for the upcoming Wednesday seminar titled Colorimetry of Memory, Contested Histories of Taiwan, scheduled for 18th February 2026 at 3 p.m. IST. Details about the event can be found on the ICS website, or you can subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so